To Whom the Wild Belongs by Reno Hunt. Chapter 7. Morning came with a hazy glow of soft light. After this sleepless night, Alan was in no hurry to leap from the pile of branches and come face to face with God knows what kind of hungry critter had been sniffing around. It was slow and careful movements until he stood erect outside the shelter, scanning the surrounding area. All clear as his fear subsided and his thirst and hunger reiterated their objections. No sense staying at altitude now. The red tape, the sleeping bag, the jugs of water, and the truck were gone. Oh, he could envision those sparkling jugs of water. In his mind, the morning sun glimmered through the sweet, cold water that was so clear he could almost smell it. Alan shook the mesmerizing image from his head and forced his mind to focus on his next move. For now, the only way to go was down. When he hit a stream or river, Alan would follow it downstream and hoped it would empty into Lava Lake, which happened to have a highway that ran next to it. Wait, did he say a highway? That would suggest that there was more than one highway. More correctly, the lake had the only highway on Earth for all practical purposes. He thought about it winding along the neatly groomed scenic overlook and the emerald water lapping at black sand along its shores. That delicious emerald water. Quit thinking about that. Alan scolded himself aloud before he began his careful descent. He was wary of the steepness of the slope, concerned about a twisted ankle or worse. A few hundred yards down the slope, a noise came from above. It was the unmistakable sound of a rock bouncing down the side of the mountain behind him. From the sound of it, this was a single softball-sized stone and not a landslide collapsing upon him. But the fact that something had clearly knocked it loose and sent it on its descent gave him chills. Alan quickened his pace and took a steeper route until the slope plateaued in a meadow and began to climb up a wooded hill. At the bottom, Alan took another piece of red tape and tied it to a bare limb, then quickly scrambled up the hill in front of him to find an elevated spot where he could see the tape. Once settled in, it did not take long for his concerns to be realized. Walking into the small clearing was Slim, the black bear. Slim raised his nose to sniff the tape, and then changed directions exactly as Alan had done, and started climbing the hill below him. "You are a persistent bastard, aren't you, Slim?" Alan was thirsty and hungry, but in a hell of a lot better condition than Slim was, and he was confident that he had a puncher's chance of coming out on top of an attack at this point. However, he was not about to initiate a confrontation. Too many things could go bad. Although bear meat would be a lifesaver at this point, he thought it would be wise to stay well ahead of him and wait for Mother Nature to do the dirty work. The weak, stumbling bear could not have much life left in him, especially if Alan picked up the pace on him. Over the next few hours, Alan picked up his speed to get a little more separation and found himself in a valley with a 10-acre grassy clearing. He hurried across it, feeling exposed, and climbed the other side to get a perspective of around 100 feet above the valley floor with a broad view of the picturesque meadow. The minutes slipped by, and Alan began to wonder if old Slim had keeled over and died. Then, he finally emerged from the bush and began to walk slowly across the clearing. At that moment, a movement from the corner of his eye caught Alan's attention. A single wolf with a dark brown coat came trotting into the clearing from Alan's right. Slim stopped and caught the wolf's gaze, slowing him to a cautious walk. Alan looked along the tree line for the others that inevitably were waiting in the shadows. A lone wolf does not take on a bear, regardless of how bad off the bear is. One by one, they emerged from the forest surrounding the grassy field, cutting off every access to the safety of the trees. Black bears can climb trees, and wolves can't. They had likely followed him patiently, waiting for an opportunity, and Alan led him right into this trap. "Oh, Slim, you poor old soul." Alan wanted to turn away and put some distance between himself and the wolves, but this was his meal they were after. Besides, he kind of felt a connection to old Slim. Maybe it was pure loneliness, or maybe it was the fact that both were desperate animals with starvation knocking at their door. But he felt a strange affection for the old bear, who was just as alone as Alan was. In fact, out here, all they had was each other. Slim stood motionless in the middle of the field, with the exception of his head on a swivel eyeing the pack's advancement. Like synchronized swimmers, they tightened their perfect circle around the bear until the group of 9 stood within 10 feet of him on all sides. Alan slowly shook his head. He thought that old Slim might be able to fend off one wolf purely with size and leverage, but 9? No chance. "Come on, Slim. Make a run for it. Get to a tree." Alan pleaded aloud in a soft voice. At that moment, the first wolf to emerge sprang forward and bit down on Slim's hind quarter. Slim spun and launched a lightning-fast swipe of his big paw, sending the wolf sprawling. With his head turned towards his haunches, another lunged from the front, clamping down on the side of Slim's neck. Slim swung his head up, pulling the wolf's front feet off the ground, and whipped his head down, putting the wolf on his back. Instantly, before the wolf could escape, Slim planted both paws and all his weight on the canine's squirming body, pinning him to the ground. As calm as James Bond ordering a martini, Slim looked slowly from wolf to wolf, pausing to lock eyes for a second with each one. Then he stepped back off their writhing comrade, who bolted to the outside of the circle. The wolves looked at each other and back at Slim. The wolves, just like Alan, had sorely underestimated the amount of fight left in this sick old bear. Slim had made a very simple statement to the pack. "You can take me, but I am taking at least 2 of you with me." Alan supposed the wolves decided to find a less formidable meal as they retreated together into the woods where the first wolf had emerged. Alan stood and clapped, shouting, "Yeah, Slim! Don't mess with the old men!" The bear looked straight up at Alan, who silenced himself and crouched back down. That was stupid. The bear lowered his nose back to the ground and continued walking down Alan's trail across the meadow, prompting Alan to get moving. It was hard to wipe the smile from his face, thinking about the drama that just unfolded and hoping he would show the same poised confidence against unsurmountable odds when his time came. He wished he had had his camera. That night, Alan decided that the abundance of predators was more of a threat than the cold, so he climbed a tree to sleep. Uncomfortably wedged between the trunk and 3 branches, Alan managed a few catnaps that night, but kept waking with a jolt from dreams of falling. The morning light gave Alan the energy to climb down and start walking again. It was the second night without sleep, and he had lost count of the days without food or water. 3, 4, 5, maybe? Weak and shaky was the uniform of the day. Most of the morning was spent descending, which was fine with him. It was easier than climbing, and he knew bears were much slower and much more cautious descending than climbing. A sound in the distance was the unmistakable shh of rushing water. Alan emerged on the stream that was 10 feet wide, looked to be about 3 feet deep, and was violently pounding and foaming over ragged rocks. A fallen log over the torrent offered a safe passage for Alan to tight rope his way over. He walked up the bank on the other side and stopped looking back at the stream. It looked so delicious, and his mouth ached for just a sip. It was likely snow melt that was far too cold for much bacterial growth, but there was the dreaded beaver fever. Animal feces in the water upstream put a particularly cruel parasite in the water that will take up residence in your intestines and wreak havoc on your body. Vomiting, diarrhea, stomach cramps, gas, weakness, and who knows what else. He had read a lot of survival books. Well, survival articles would be more accurate. The commitment to a full book was beyond his attention span. One thing that he had read always stuck in his head: the rule of 3. It says you can live 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, and 3 hours without shelter. The survivalists all agreed that drinking out of a stream was clearly a bad idea. However, Alan suspected most of them did not have a hungry bear on their trail. Besides, he would not make it much longer anyway without water. The rule of 3, and it looked so cold and refreshing. Alan got on his knees and put his hands in the freezing water. Only a sip. He bent his arms to immerse his face to suck up a cap full of moisture. By the time he pulled his head back up, he had involuntarily sucked down 3 mouthfuls of the best-tasting water he had ever had. When he was a kid, they would go to the well and draw that sweet nectar to the surface that was so cold it would give you brain freeze if you drank too fast. This was that good. Times infinity. Alan lay back on the shore in ecstasy, thinking that if Slim jumped out of the bush onto him right now, he would die with a smile on his face. Knowing he had to keep moving, Alan pulled himself to his feet, headed off with a hop in his step, letting the shh of the rushing water disappear in the brush behind him. The hydration helped him put several more miles behind him before night approached. At that point, Alan felt comfortable with making a tree limb bed on the ground without Slim catching up and surprising him. Alan slept like a baby that night, waking with a sleepy-headed appreciation for what some REM time can do for a man's soul. Climbing out of the pile, he caught a twinge in his stomach just below his belly button. Rubbing his hand over it, he said aloud, "You're just being paranoid. Beaver fever takes a week to hit you." Although shaky from not eating, the water he consumed gave him the energy and mental boost he needed to maintain pace for another day. Long, steady strides made Alan feel as though the miles were disappearing beneath his feet effortlessly. The stomach cramps came and went with some gas coming on in the early afternoon and gently increasing waves of nausea by the time the shadows were long again. Alan made another pile, crawled in and curled up in as small a ball as he could. He did not feel right. The sleep-robbing nausea persisted and was soon joined by shivers and shakes, the likes of which should not plague him in this pile of vegetation on such a warm night. Alan's stomach clenched its fist and then released over and over again. This was going to be another very long night.